Welcome to the Season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
To meet global climate targets, renewable energy sources such as solar and wind will need to be deployed at scale. This will mean large-scale mining and processing of critical minerals such as cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, which form key components of the solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles required for energy transition. To understand the role of critical minerals in energy transition, including whether the world has enough of these minerals, we spoke to Dr. Seaver Wang, co-director of the Climate and Energy team at the United States-based Breakthrough Institute. Dr. Wang writes on critical minerals and recently published a paper titled Future Demand for Electricity Generation Materials Under Different Climate Mitigation Scenarios, which unpacks the feasibility of using critical minerals at scale to meet climate goals.
Seaver, welcome. Welcome to the India Energy Hour. It's truly a pleasure to know you and seeing you grow, through Twitter and social media, but also through some of our interactions. See you grow as a really solid energy and climate scholar over the last 3-4 years that I've known you. So it's really a pleasure to have you on the podcast and talk to you about this really important and critical question of critical mining. And we'll reflect on some of the recent paper that you wrote, but first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, Shreya, Sandeep, thanks so much for having me. As many of your guests have said on the podcast over the months, like them, I am just such a fan of the work that you two have been doing, such a big fan of the podcast. I'm tremendously honored to be on today for this episode. Very excited to talk about critical minerals.
Great. So let's get started. As you know, we start our podcast with the story of the scholar or the academic or the official that we invite. So in this case, let's get started with your journey. Where are you from? What did you study? I know you were an oceanographer before venturing into climate and energy space and now doing some really fascinating and important work in this space. So tell us your story of how you evolved as a scholar and how did you get here?
Sure. Yeah, it might be a shorter story than for some of our other guests because I guess I'm a little younger on average than many of the people that you've had on. But it's been quite a path. I started out, when I was young, like many who go into earth science or climate science, I was very interested in the environment. I grew up around a lot of nature. I was interested in how animals and plants and ecosystems interact. And then I was very interested in environmental issues very early on too, because my background is I'm Chinese American. I'm the son of Chinese immigrant parents to the U.S. We would go back to China every few years, and I saw very clearly how different the air quality was over there every few years when we went to visit Beijing or Shanghai. And so I knew that the environment was very important to me, and that there were also a lot of environmental problems. But what really got me super interested in the environment and in climate was in 2007 when former US Vice President Al Gore released his famous climate documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, and that really radicalized me as a high school student. I suddenly decided that environmental issues were what I really wanted to make an impact on, and I decided that I wanted to study environmental science in college. And so I went on to my undergraduate degree at the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied earth science. And at the same time, I was a very radical student climate activist. I was one of the many college students who were mobilized by the famous US environmentalist Bill McKibben to go protest against oil pipelines. I got arrested outside the White House once for protesting an oil pipeline. And I tried to divest my university from fossil fuels and did all sorts of things. And at the same time, I was doing my earth science classes and just really fascinated. Earth science was just this science of how the world works, everything from how the monsoon circulation works to how the ocean currents work. And I just loved every bit of it. I started doing some research and found that really interesting. And I had always been interested in science. So I was very inclined towards earth science on the one hand. And on the other hand, doing all of this activism, I had thought at the time that what you really needed to do for people to listen to you was to become a famous climate scientist. And so I thought, I need to become a professor. So I need to go into academia. And so I pursued grad school. And at the time, I knew that there were a lot of unanswered questions in oceans and climate. And I'd always been interested in the oceans too. So I decided I'll do oceanography. And so I went to Duke for my PhD. I studied oceans and climate. Specifically, I studied plankton and how plankton play a role in carbon and in nitrogen cycling in the oceans, which is a very important question for climate. And I really liked that. I really liked going out onto the ocean and doing lab work. And my advisor was great. And I confirmed for myself that I really liked research. At the same time, I sort of learned firsthand that people are not actually that interested in plankton, no matter how polite they may be in a conversation with you. And so I realized that basic research in the earth science was maybe a little too separate from societal problems, from problems that really impact people, and it was too distant from solutions. So about midway through my PhD, I decided that I maybe wanted to take a different path. I wanted to get more involved in policy. I wanted to get more involved in energy research. And so I told this to my advisor at that time, who was very supportive. And I began looking at opportunities after I finished my PhD studies that would bring me more into the nonprofit world, into the government world, or into the think tank world. And so when I graduated in the spring of 2019, that's what brought me to the Breakthrough Institute, where I began my career change and where I continue to work now. I started out at the Breakthrough Institute in fall of 2019 as a junior climate and energy analyst. My boss at the time was Dr. Zeke Housefather, who really mentored me in my first couple of years. He was tremendously important to my growth. And so I started off at Breakthrough writing about climate science and future climate impacts. And because Breakthrough is such a small organization, we were just 16 people at the time. Now we're around 26 or so. We all had to cover a lot of ground. So it was necessary for me to become a huge energy nerd. And at the same time, I knew I was doing a lot of catch up because, I was arriving young on the scene and people had done a tremendous amount of work on how to deploy solar panels quickly or how to deploy electric vehicles quickly, and I needed to find my own niche. And so I began thinking a little further upstream about how clean technologies are manufactured, about how we get the minerals that are necessary to make solar panels or wind turbines or electric vehicles. And I found that to be very interesting. And so this paper that we're going to talk about today, I began that work in the spring of 2020. A very interesting time, and I guess a long time ago. Academic publishing takes so long. And so this really became one of my research niches. I work now on critical minerals, on low carbon technology manufacturing, and then I have a couple of other niches as well. I'm very interested in climate and energy policy in East Asia, particularly Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. And I also continue to write about earth science, future emissions scenarios, and climate impacts.
Okay. So I guess my first question is how did you get interested in energy? Because, it's one thing to know about climate. It's one thing because climate has so many pieces, right? Some people get interested in forests. Some people nature-based. There's so many different subfields within climate. So did you read a paper or did you talk to somebody, or I don't know how you got really interested in the field of energy? In itself, it's quite niche. So I'm just wondering how you got in that space.
Yeah, it also started pretty early on. I first learned about the different energy technologies in middle school when I did a project on air pollution. And I was like, oh, okay, so wind, solar, nuclear, hydro, they don't produce air pollution, but there are various advantages and disadvantages. And then you have coal and gas. So in middle school is when I first learned about the energy technologies. And then as I became more interested, especially on the climate activist side, less so the climate science side, you just have to know about energy. So in high school, I was trying to sign up teachers and parents for wind energy. I grew up a little outside of New York City, and this is in Connecticut. And they had some early wind farms, and you could sign up your house to supposedly source your electricity from these wind farms. And I was very excited about this at the time. And then, as a college student activist, I had to know something about the oil pipeline that I was protesting. I had to be able to tell. I went to a couple of Congress people's offices as a student and talked about, the risks of water pollution from fracking, et cetera. So I was reading and studying a bit about energy at the same time, sort of throughout all of this process. But certainly energy wasn't a part of my job description until I began the job at Breakthrough. So it was a lot of learning by doing and sort of catch up and learning as quickly as I possibly could. So I certainly wasn't an expert at the time that I made this career shift, but I'd always been interested in it and been reading articles and sort of been very passionate about clean energy from the beginning.
That's great to know. And given that, people cover a supply chain and everything, I think you have a 360-degree view of the whole, if I may say, the issue or the topic per se, from climate to energy, critical minerals, everything. So I believe you would be in a good position to answer this very macro and very high-level question that would the world be able to, maintain the global warming temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Do you think that is a possibility as things stand right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that's very painful for me to answer, from my background with all this climate activist past. It's sad to say, I don't think that humanity will achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And, at one time, I really believed that we could. And it was actually my fellow grad school classmates in the Earth and Ocean Sciences department at Duke who convinced me that it might not be possible. I thought, if we can just try really, really hard and overcome the political obstacles, then surely we can make it possible. Mathematically, it's possible to do. But it was my fellow grad students who communicated to me just how steep the curve was and how the world would need to cut emissions in half by 2030 and then reach net zero emissions by 2050 in order to even just have a 2/3 chance of achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And this was around 2016 when they first convinced me, and it's been 7 years since then, and global emissions have continued to rise or at least remain flat since COVID. And so we haven't made much progress since those 7 years. So now I would say I'm not particularly confident that we can meet the 1.5 Celsius target. So for example, we know that China's national climate policy will not peak Chinese emissions until around 2030 potentially. And China is about around a quarter of global emissions. So that would mean that the rest of the world would have to cut their CO2 emissions by 75% by 2030. And of course, as many of the podcast listeners know, that's very unlikely for India to do. That's very unlikely for Indonesia to do, for Japan to do, for the United States to do, for Europe to do even. And so I really think this isn't just happening. Now, as someone familiar with climate science, I also know that 1.5 degrees Celsius isn't the whole ballgame. There isn't some sort of catastrophic cliff that happens right at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Every 1/10 of a degree matters. It's a matter of degrees, and climate impacts are along a slope. It's not a cliff. And so really, we just have to do the best that we can do as fast as we possibly can. But the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, I'm sad to say, is slipping out of reach.
So it's quite depressing to hear that, but it is a reality, obviously. And every year there is one excuse or another from one or the other nation. At times it's a war between two countries. At times we blame that a particular country has a closed economy and they're doing something else. And I don't think a global dialogue here works anymore. And I might be asking a very, very controversial question out here, but this COPs that is happening, in my eyes, who started covering this barely 3-4 years back, I don't think, it has failed in its motive altogether. So maybe we need to reimagine this whole thing. And something that most of the countries are doing is that look inside rather than outside. It's futile asking for a climate fund and everything. These are just my thoughts to you.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me as well. I remember being very fascinated by the earlier episode you guys had with Navraz Dubash, who talked about the intricacies of the geopolitics and the negotiating that go into all of this. And, I've always heard in the field of international relations that international relations is really described as a sort of anarchy. It's not as if every country is ultimately looking out for their own interests. And so I was disillusioned with the sort of international climate diplomacy process for a long time. And perhaps Paris was really quite of an unusual high point. And we've had some notable commitments, I guess, in recent years with China and India sort of committing to go net zero. But certainly, it's a very difficult process, and there's a lot of inequity in this process as well, especially on, adaptation and loss and damages. I think really it's this challenge of navigating that anarchy, that self-interest, which on the one hand, because now all of a sudden everyone's very interested in clean technologies and electric vehicles, there's some things that are now sort of coinciding with the right incentives where countries want to dominate these technologies. And so they're beginning to move faster and faster on these things. But on the other hand, you have things like adaptation, like climate finance, which are not in the self-interest of many countries and which are getting neglected. And so it's this really challenging field. At the same time, I think, fortunately, we have an increasing global civil society, an increasing global connectiveness, which I do think increases the moral pressure on countries to do something, even if it's not enough. And so you have that helping as well. And it's all this mix of competing factors, which is often very frustrating, but which you hope that you sort of yank on the right levers as hard as you can and sort of get change moving in the right direction.
I guess that speaks a lot about the importance of working at the national level and also pushing nationally. Of course, I think one of the things I think about the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC framework is at least it's kind of trying to set the right big picture. Maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not accurate, but at least I think to some degree you need that bigger, larger vision. So maybe it may still be relevant. I mean, yes, a country declaring a net zero is different from actually reaching it, but at least there's that vision. Well, there's lots to talk about even this high-level topic, but I really want to drill down and double-click on the topic at hand, which is the topic of critical minerals. So, obviously, we need to move away from fossil fuels. There's very few pathways through any modeling which will say that, okay, you can continue to burn fossil fuels and you'll still meet 1.5. You cannot deploy so much of other CCS and other stuff. So what we mean is if we have to move away from fossil fuels, we have to deploy a lot of clean energy like solar, wind, nuclear, etc. If that were to happen, there's been a demand for lots of critical minerals around the world. And so can you describe for the audience, what do we energy nerds keep talking about this? What is critical minerals? And, is it defined similarly in every country or is it defined differently? And how important are they for the ongoing energy transition?
Yeah, so you sort of hinted at this with your question just now, but critical minerals are defined differently between different countries. Different countries have different lists, and they have different criteria by which they designate critical minerals. So the US, for example, has a list of around 50 minerals that it considers as critical minerals, and that has some legal significance in the US. But the general criteria that countries use to think about critical minerals are minerals that are crucial for key sort of strategic technologies that might be military, that might be aerospace, that might be particularly important industries for that country. And there's also the question of supply. Sometimes these minerals are considered in short supply, or their supply chains are very highly concentrated in certain countries. And as a result, considering these criteria together, countries consider these materials to have sort of geostrategic value. And I think they have some point. At the same time, there are some people who criticize the whole critical minerals framing altogether. They're sort of uncomfortable with how they're framed geopolitically. And I think they have a point as well, because in the end, critical minerals are subjective. They're a human term. They're not geological in any scientific sense. And so I think it's important to remember that we pick which minerals are critical. And perhaps the way of thinking about them as this sort of scarce, even if only temporarily scarce resource that we need to be really sort of anxious about may not necessarily always be the most healthy framing either. So I think that subjectivity is important to keep in mind as well when we're talking about sort of how we define critical minerals. And so some examples of critical minerals are, for example, for electric vehicles, lithium or graphite or cobalt, these sort of battery minerals. And for sort of clean energy technologies, you need, for example, rare earth metals in the permanent magnet gearbox of wind turbines. You need a lot of copper in all clean energy technologies. And then you need things like silver or polysilicon in solar panels. These are some examples of critical minerals.
So if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the general definition of critical minerals goes beyond just clean energy, their usage in the clean energy technology. It also encompasses things like military use and strategic use, etc. Is that a fair understanding of your answer?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
And if you can also, add to it that which are the countries or which are the agencies which are currently controlling critical mineral mining and supply chain across the globe, which could be a major geopolitical tussle point in coming years.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll maybe talk about sort of the idea of control and the geopolitical tussling a little bit, which is, I think a lot of people are sort of adapting the way in which we think about oil and natural gas to critical minerals. Some people theorize that critical minerals will sort of be the oil of the future. Maybe even that countries might go to war over deposits of critical minerals. And I really don't think that's the case. And I think that's an incorrect way of thinking about critical minerals. I don't think that critical minerals are the oil of the future. Countries' economies will not collapse because they can't get enough rare earth metals or copper in a given year. But critical minerals are still absolutely geopolitically important. And I think the reason why they're geopolitically important is because, on the one hand, they're important for things like military technologies, or maybe they're important for an industry that you're very interested in getting involved in, like electric vehicle manufacturing. And so they're economically important in that sense. But I think they're important in another sense as well, in that they might be one of the critical factors that influence how quickly a country can navigate the clean energy transition, or how quickly a set of countries can navigate the clean energy transition. And especially in this post-Russia's invasion of Ukraine world, we understand how important energy security is, and how important it is to have an affordable, reliable source of electricity, of industrial heat for a country's economy. And sort of whether you're in the middle of a clean energy transition or after the clean energy transition, the countries that are able to produce goods with affordable, reliable energy now in a fossil fueled world may not be the same countries that are able to produce industrial goods affordably in the future, when you have a carbon constraint where you can't just produce cars or steel and emit all this carbon. And so critical minerals are important for determining how good of a job you can do at sort of navigating the clean energy transition, both midway through and once you're done. And so I think that's one reason why critical minerals are important. And so critical minerals are mined in many places, depending on the mineral. So for example, lithium is mined currently in Australia, in some countries in South America, and in China. And one thing to keep in mind is that the countries that sort of are the largest players in these supply chains today are not necessarily the only countries that have these minerals. They're actually just the countries that have invested early on in this extraction, or that have invested very heavily in the downstream mineral refining and processing. And so that's why they have such a large share of these supply chains today. It's not that these minerals are super, super rare in most cases, just that some countries have moved early, so to speak. And so it's a question really of investment and expansion of these supply chains by other countries. But I suppose it all really comes back to China, which has invested at very large scale, very early on, especially in the midstream of how some of these minerals are sourced and processed. So China controls a huge proportion of global lithium processing, global graphite extraction and refining for both synthetic and natural graphite, cobalt processing, rare earth metal refining. And in many cases, it's because these industries are very energy intensive and also a little sort of have environmental consequences. And so other countries have perhaps been reluctant to invest to the same degree that China has to now. But we're sort of seeing that change, of course, as countries become increasingly anxious about the geopolitical concentration of these supply chains, and also as countries increasingly see the value of these critical minerals in the global economy.
Seaver, while we really talked about, countries and within their borders producing critical minerals and processing, I do want to, even for a couple minutes or more, reflect on the fact that critical minerals might be available in the sea or the space, and your thoughts on where that process is currently at, and what do you see the prospect of countries or, group of countries going after the ocean? And I know that there's lots of issues with that.
Yeah, such applications could really change the picture, but they are quite difficult. I'm particularly skeptical about mining asteroids or the moon anytime soon. Some people are very excited about this, but I'll believe it when I see it. Sourcing minerals from the ocean is much more viable in the near term, and there are already sort of existing exploratory efforts and companies that have even committed to near-term sort of exploitation of seabed minerals. And I think this could be very interesting if done right. I think you have to make sure that there's good environmental oversight of deep sea mining. But at the same time, I'm actually perhaps, this is somewhat of an opinion that might be heretical for an oceanographer even, but I'm actually much more open-minded to deep sea mining than perhaps some of my fellow oceanographers, because we're impacting the land to such a degree with the mining that we do today. And I think there is a real potential for some of these deep sea mining technologies to be on the net less impactful to the ocean than current mining is to land. And so we've been paying such an environmental cost to mine all this iron ore, all this nickel, all these rare earth metals from land. And 75% of the Earth's surface, the abyssal floor, is perhaps the most common surface on Earth. And so if the ocean can maybe pay a bit of a price, and if we can do this well from the start, then maybe that can spare the land a lot of impacts. And that can also spare human communities on the Earth a lot of impacts, because unlike on land where there's always a village or a town near the mine, this isn't as much of a problem for the ocean. And so it potentially alleviates some of the environmental justice aspects of this. But that's a very controversial viewpoint. I know a lot of oceanographers who disagree very strongly with this. So what I really think is, we have to test out these technologies with a lot of oversight. And if they work out well, then we should be open-minded to it. But I'm not saying, go mine the oceans right away, but we should be open-minded to it. And what I bring up also is that there's a third route of mineral extraction, which are these really unconventional terrestrial mineral deposits. You might be able to get lithium and other valuable minerals, for example, from geothermal brines, just from producing geothermal energy. And this might be a dramatically lower impact way of mining lithium or these other minerals than we've been doing in the past. Or you might be able to go into coal ashes that have been burned in coal power plants and extract valuable minerals from them. And of course, these are very experimental. Whether they work or not, or are economically viable, is an open question. But I'm interested also in this sort of third route of unconventional mineral resources as well, which might be able to both reduce impacts and also be a new source of minerals, sort of on top of existing sort of geological reserves and sort of resources.
I know Shreya has a follow-up, but let me ask you one. Since you made this opinion, since you have this strong opinion, I have to suggest you rather to do a study, if you can, or, we can perhaps collaborate, looking at the impact of critical minerals in the sea and the impact of critical mineral mining on the land using a set of indicators and comparing which has more impact or less. I think that would be a really fascinating study. But anyway, I'll keep that to a discussion offline, but I will let Shreya.
And I know where this opportunity might be given to you. Just 2 days back, the Secretary of Ministry of Mines here in India has announced that the Indian government would be looking at critical mineral mining in ocean bed. And he is hiring consultants to suggest the way forward. So apply away.
I know some people have said that I'm very well suited for potentially this question, given my oceanography background, certainly. And we have had conversations on Breakthrough that this should be an area that we should try and have some impact in. So certainly not the first time that I've thought about researching this question further.
Right. No, it's a fascinating area, and I believe there would be a lot of movement in this space. I wanted to actually go back to what you were talking about earlier about the whole geopolitical issue that emerges in critical minerals. There might not be a war happening, as you mentioned, but clearly how global alliances would be reshaped because of this. India courting Australia and Argentina, US and UK, given their more Indo-Pacific tilt, would look at new kind of alliances, and China has its own set of issues. So do you see that emerge? And it might not create a war-like situation, but what would a climate dialogue then look like, if I may ask you?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I do worry particularly about developing countries getting caught in between these sorts of tensions. My hope is that countries can realize that critical minerals are not oil, that this is not sort of an existential problem, and that you can sort of strike a productive middle ground by diversifying supply chains enough that you don't feel insecure about, cutting off your rare earth metal supply or things like this, where countries can get enough mineral security that they feel more comfortable about these things, but at the same time not go overboard, because I think there would be some negative impacts if countries tried to be totally mineral independent, which I think would just be a fool's errand. I think this would be totally unfeasible for countries to try and source all of their minerals from just within their own borders, or even just from within a small group of friends. I think you have to realize that globalization has happened, that you're going to be trading these commodities globally, and you have to just come to terms to that. That's probably the most efficient way to navigate the clean energy transition. That would perhaps be my message to policymakers. And so, by all means, make sure that you're not too dependent on one source or another, but you don't need to go all out and become super paranoid about this, or become super offended because a country that you're sourcing minerals from is also sourcing minerals to a country that you don't like. I would really tell policymakers to sort of chill out a bit about this. And so I see some risks associated with this. And I guess as we see from the Russia's war in Ukraine, there's always this risk that countries just for sheer self-interest might pursue a really valuable mineral deposit or something like that. And so I think that's really for the global community to be on the lookout from, and to sort of, through diplomacy and through strategy, really try and dissuade countries from doing that. And so I suppose that's a worry as well. But I really just hope that people can keep a cool head and realize that these things are not the new oil. It's not a matter of life and death, and sort of just manage this problem sort of diplomatically and responsibly.
Fantastic. I mean, I realized that it's almost 35 minutes and haven't even started talking about your paper, because there's so much to discuss here. But let me zoom in on your recent and really fascinating paper. Congratulations to you and your co-authors. I've read it twice and I have really liked, but I have lots of questions. So, your new paper, Future Demand for Electricity Generation Materials under Different Climate Mitigation Scenarios, was published recently. And you also did a really nice Twitter thread explaining. So for our listeners, if you want to just understand the summary of the paper, I highly recommend going and checking out Seaver's Twitter thread. So let's, just describe what the paper is about, what is the methodology, and then we'll come to the findings. But lay out the big picture, tell us how you got there.
Sure, yeah. So for this paper, we really looked at three big questions. The first question was, are there enough of all these minerals and materials to navigate the clean energy transition in the electricity sector? So this paper looked only at the electricity sector. It didn't consider electric vehicles. It also didn't consider storage, so just electricity generation technologies. And the question was, do we have enough of these things, which is a question that people ask a lot. And then the second question is, of course, how much of these things do we need? And then the third question, which comes up a lot, particularly in some online discussions, is, okay, so we know that you need to emit a lot to produce steel or to produce copper or to produce rare earth metals. Are we going to blow past our climate targets just because we have to mine all this material and smelt all this material and make all these metals? And so that's a very key question too. And so the quick answers to all these questions are, first, there are enough of all these materials. And then second, we can talk about sort of how much of these materials we need in more detail later. And then third, we will not destroy our climate targets just from producing all of these minerals. We know how much emissions it takes to produce a ton of copper or a ton of steel. And as it turns out, even in very ambitious climate scenarios where we're installing a ton of solar panels or a ton of wind turbines, at most you consume only 10% or so of the 1.5C climate targets. So it's not an insignificant amount, but it also will not blow past these climate targets just from producing the metals that we would need to navigate the clean energy transition. And the amount of emissions that you would avoid from doing this very aggressive build out of clean energy technologies would be much greater than the amount that you would emit in the process of making all of these things. And the approach for our study was a modeling approach. We did a literature review of how many tons of copper and rare earth metals you need to build a wind turbine, or how many tons of copper, silver, and solar-grade polysilicon you need to make a solar panel. We took all of these literature values and did a Monte Carlo analysis. And then we also combined this with a bunch of IPCC modeling scenarios, the so-called integrated assessment models. We looked at 75 of these different scenarios and categorized them by ambition. So we looked at 1.5 degree scenarios. We looked at 2 degree scenarios. We looked at warmer than 2 degree scenarios. And then we compared how much in each given year in these models, there's an implied amount of solar and wind deployment. And we basically did a multiplication exercise with the model where we took our mineral intensities and then we took the solar and wind deployment, and then we calculated in each year how much copper you'd need, how much aluminum you'd need, and then you sum up across the 30-year period from 2020 to 2050, and you get the final value of how many million tons or billions of tons of material you would need.
No, I just wanted to understand, and also for the benefit of our listeners, when we say reserves, we are talking about commercially extractable reserves, right? Not something that is still on the paper.
Right. Yeah. So we looked at both resources and reserves for this paper. So resources is just the total amount that we know of that's in the ground for, say, copper or rare earth metals. Reserves, you're correct, Shreya, that reserves are an economic accounting measure, and they reflect sort of how much of a given material is economically viable to extract at a given moment. And so this actually is a much more complicated metric, which takes into account several factors. It takes into account the ore quality, which influences how economically viable it is to extract a particular deposit. What also matters is the type of deposit, whether it's a deep underground or whether it's just at the surface, influences how easy it's to get and therefore influences the cost of extraction. And then another factor that influences the cost of extraction is the current state of extraction technology, which could get better over time and open up new reserves. And then finally, you have the value of the mineral itself. If it's very low value, then it might not be very valuable to extract, but the value suddenly shoots up, then your reserves could actually grow because the amount of stuff that's in the ground that's desirable to go after could actually increase. And so reserves are a metric that actually evolves over time, whereas resources is sort of the larger metric, which may include a lot of stuff that's not valuable today to go after because of limitations in extraction technology, or the deposit is very low grade, which could in the future become part of reserves.
Okay, great. So I just want to go back to two of your larger methodological questions. And you've reflected that as kind of like your limitation. You haven't said that, but it's implicit that one is that you looked at only the electricity sector, right? What do you anticipate if you look at the whole economy? If you start looking at, industries and agriculture, or the different processes for which critical minerals are required, do you think this number or this will look very different? And what is the order of magnitude we're talking about? Maybe it's a hazard guess, or maybe you know the answer, but I would love to know your view on that.
Sure, yeah. So I think for some things, it matters a great deal. So for example, for rare earth metals are used in the magnet drives in wind turbines, but they're also used in the magnet drives in electric vehicles. And so in our analysis, we calculate that future demand for rare earth metals would force rare earth metals production to increase by 3 to 4 times over the next few decades. The annual rate of rare earth metal production would need to increase by 3 to 4 times. And we know that you would also have additional demand from the electric vehicle sector. And so comparing our results and adding the electric vehicle demand from reports such as the IEA Critical Minerals Report, you would actually potentially need to increase rare earth metals in total by to 7 times. And so that gives you a sense for, when you factor in electric vehicles, how much of an added demand this might be. So I don't think this would matter for things like steel or cement, where most of the demand is in construction today. But for other things like battery minerals especially, this could matter a great deal. So you would have a good amount of copper and aluminum demand in particular that would go into batteries, and this would be fairly substantial. I have done some separate calculations for lithium to confirm that the available lithium reserves and resources would be sufficient to support even a fairly large build out of electric vehicles. And of course, there's debate about how much of a electric vehicle build out would be desirable. But I don't see any concerns on that, and in particular on most of the battery minerals. I do, however, would always be on the lookout because there could always be something unexpected. So for example, in the hydrogen sector, you might need iridium or you might need platinum group metals for fuel cells and for your electrolyzers. And we're not sure quite yet how much hydrogen we'll need in the future clean energy economy. And so there very might well be a future follow-on study to my study by very likely by someone else who might look at the hydrogen side and who might find out, oh, wait, we might not actually have enough iridium. And I could totally see that being a finding. And so I wouldn't say that we're out of the woods yet on everything. There's always mineral substitution, there's always changing technologies, and there's a lot of technologies that haven't been invented yet, even potentially for decarbonization of some hard to decarbonize sectors. And so we don't really know the full minerals sector picture. And so I think, as you say, Sandeep, this is perhaps one limitation of our study. But at least for the things we looked at, and maybe for electric vehicles, we're pretty confident that on those fronts, there's not anything to worry about that's been identified quite yet.
Fantastic. And this is, again, obviously taking your paper, but kind of trying to reflect on the integrated assessment models. I don't know if you followed, there was a set of papers by some Indian scholars, Tejal Kadavkar and Jayaraman, about equity scenarios and how they critique the integrated assessment models. So if I were to create a scenario which is equitable, you can imagine that sub-Saharan Africa or India or other poorer nations will have much more energy demand, right? In that scenario, and this is, I mean, I know this is way beyond the scope of what you did, but I would love your just a guess on what you think. If we were to reach that high energy growth in all countries scenario, do you think the game will shift? Even just in the electricity sector, but overall also?
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember seeing that preprint on the equity in the IEA scenarios, and I immediately thought about this study, and I was like, oh boy, yeah, I'm just using the standard IAMs. So I think you're absolutely right. And I did think about this a bit. And if you look at the margin sort of the difference between the amount that I've calculated that you would need in these scenarios to meet sort of projected demand in these IAMs and the amount that's available in the ground. And even if you multiply the amount that I've calculated by 2 to 3 times, in most cases for these minerals, the reserves would still be sufficient. Even if you just very crudely say, okay, let's multiply this by 2, let's multiply this by 3. And so I think that the geological constraints would be there, but it would certainly increase the amount of growth that some of these industries would need to see in order to meet that expanded demand. If perhaps, as we hope, we're vastly underestimating the degree to which the electricity sector, for example, grows in the world over the next 30 years. So I think it could catch us by surprise potentially in meeting demand in a given year, sort of the rate of production. But overall, I don't think it would change the resource availability question as much. But I think that's a great question.
I'm absolutely fascinated by all these details. This is like my induction into this particular industry, apart from reading a little bit about it, writing whatever much is available, but great insights. I think I've learned much more in today's discussion than I could have. So I'll ask one question from the lens of a developing country. Currently, as we were discussing, the focus is how rich countries, OECDs can, compete with China on critical minerals. So now when the race has already started for critical minerals, where do you place developing countries? And do you think there is a strategy? Do you see a strategy emerging? If not, what do you think developing nations should do? We can take India as a case in point, or any other country that you wish to.
Sure. Yeah. I think so. The current position of developing countries when it comes to this sort of increasing interest in critical minerals is one of opportunity, but also risk. I think it could really be a potential to drive economic development and sort of really help many countries sort of jump into a value-added sort of a position in the global value chain. But there's also sort of risks because of, geopolitical paranoia. And there's also a risk that developing countries don't get the full value of the mineral deposits that they hold if they're merely exporting sort of lower value ore it's other countries that are sort of reaping the benefits of processing that into higher value commodities or manufacturing sort of finished goods from those critical materials. And so I would say that the strategy of developing countries, and we're seeing this now, it's really not my idea, but policymakers in countries like Zimbabwe or the DRC are already demanding this now, is really to negotiate hard with countries that are interested in extracting minerals sort of within your borders and demand investment in downstream value-added industries, sort of beyond just setting up the mine, sort of really negotiating hard for the establishment of a processing facility so that you could export not just the ore, but the refined metal. And I think that's really key. I think it's really important for governments to realize the negotiating position that they have with the value of these critical minerals and to do things like pass higher royalties on each ton of ore that's extracted, enforce high environmental standards, ensure that companies are meeting their cleanup liabilities, ensure that your regulatory regime is sort of in place so you can demand, for example, fines in the event of environmental or labor violations, and sort of make sure that the distribution of impacts and benefits is more fair in this sense. And I think there's also a geopolitical question to this as well, which is really sort of communicating in diplomacy that, development is the priority for low and middle income countries, and really communicating to wealthier countries or to countries that are maybe contesting critical minerals that low and middle income countries can't be too idealistic. These are sort of transactional relationships, really sort of communicating that, I'm a country that has this mineral. I'm going to make deals with all kinds of countries. These are not declarations of loyalty. You ought to give me freedom of association here. And, if you want a deal, then offer me a better deal. And I'm not going to exclude anyone. So I'm just going to work with everyone, and sort of really communicating that that's the diplomatic stance. And perhaps there's opportunities for countries that have critical minerals to even partner together. Again, critical minerals are not oil. This will not be OPEC, but potentially by sort of collaborating in a multilateral sense, you can improve your negotiating position. And so rather than being pitted against one another, you can sort of work together to negotiate hard and get the best possible deal out of countries that sort of are interested in these mineral sectors.
Okay, that's fascinating. So let me ask you a really quick and straight question. Do you think developing countries should try to create an OPEC for not production, but processing? I think the main game is processing. If I could be wrong here, but if you control processing, then you really control the end use in terms of who you sell to. So do you think the focus of developing countries who don't have critical minerals or who are not mining could be to get into the processing space rather than try to mine and process? Or do you think both are important?
I do think that processing is very important. I think you're absolutely right. I would be very interested to see if countries were to try to create a critical minerals OPEC. I don't know if it would be the right move for every country, because we see how OPEC works today. There's this oil quota system, which some countries game, and you have some sort of perverse incentives. You have this thing where we all know that many of the Middle Eastern members of OPEC are inflating their estimates of oil reserves because how much you can produce is based on how much your declared reserves are, et cetera. And so you may have a very strong negotiating position as part of this cartel, but there's competition within that cartel. And so countries need to think very hard about whether they want to participate in that individually, et cetera. And so that's really sort of an economic game theory question almost, to whether it's a good idea. Certainly it increases their negotiating potential as a group, but there's sort of it's potentially a two-edged decision, so to speak. But I would be very interested to follow such a trend if that's the direction that countries choose to go in. But I do think that processing is very important. Really, we've seen over the last few decades with many resource economies that if you're just exporting the unfinished ore, then it's not capturing as much of the economic value chain as one could. And oftentimes, that's a very finite resource. Whereas the expertise to process that mineral, if your own resources runs out, then you could import ore from another country and then continue to be a major player in that industry going forward. So, and you gain, industrial experience. It's just such a big increase in sort of economic position that I think it's very important to focus on.
One of my key interests in energy transition is also looking at the social and economic side of this transition. So I was just wondering if you have come across literature or you have done research around, when a country's open mines or processing units in their places, does it bring economic benefit to them or not? And is there any literature that proves that no, it's not? Or is there literature that shows that, there are some benefits, but it can be improved, whether it is in terms of jobs or royalties, etc. I don't know if you've reflected on that, or it's a future topic, but I'd love to know your views on that.
And if I may add to this economics part, the social part as well, when I hear mining, I just picture coal mining. And so my concern as a very novice person to this subject is that is there a chance of a story of coal being repeated in these critical minerals as well? Because we are hearing sporadic stories about how lithium mining in some nations is leading to some or the other human rights violation or social violation. So if you can address this question in two parts or however you wish to.
Yeah. I do think that the social and environmental considerations are very fraught, and currently there's a lot of risks. The issue is that mining always has, of course, environmental impacts and risks to the workers. But mining is also a business. So companies, want to maximize their profit margins. And so if you can mine in a country that has a more lax regulatory regime where you can get away with sort of poor safety standards, et cetera, that has the potential to lead to a race to the bottom, to where you're able to maximize your profit margin at the expense of the community that's hosting the mining, at the expense of the people that are doing the mining. And I think one really necessary development for sort of the global community will be to standardize how mining is done internationally, to make it so that companies and industry actors can't game this system by trying to seek out sort of the most vulnerable communities, and to establish sort of third-party, whether private or whether sort of multilateral intergovernmental frameworks that really enforce accountability on the industry. And I think that this can really help avoid some of the excesses that have been seen in the past. And to your question of economic benefits, Sandeep, I think it's really been a very diverse story. There are certainly countries that have had very resource-oriented economies like Chile that have managed to sort of capture more of the economic growth and benefits associated with those industries, particularly by developing some of the downstream capacity in these value chains. And there have also been countries. One example that comes to mind to me is I believe Palau, which has in the past been a large producer of phosphate rock for fertilizer. But they just developed the phosphate rock and shipped it internationally at large local environmental consequences without as much sort of investment in the long term. And so now those phosphate deposits are depleted, and sort of those countries are being confronted with a major economic transition now, sort of similar to how we might talk about the coal just transition. And so it's really a question of sort of investing wisely in the future on the part of sort of countries and communities that have those resources, and also sort of creating really sort of robust frameworks for accountability more broadly for these materials and supply chains to ensure that sort of good standards are being met. And it's a difficult challenge, but one that probably will be perhaps the challenge of the clean tech supply chains going forward in the next couple decades.
Fantastic. I have one last question. We talked about so many different topics that it's almost an hour. So I have one last question. So what's next now? Now you've arrived in the critical minerals space with this kind of research. What's next? What are the new research questions you're thinking about, whether it's on critical minerals or beyond? Like, what's the work and the questions that you're thinking about for the next 2-3 years so that we can look forward to it?
Yeah. So on the minerals front, I'm actually precisely interested in this question that we just talked about, which is sort of social and environmental governance of mineral extraction. We're very interested in sort of crafting policy recommendations for how to do this more responsibly, what some of these sort of multilateral or third-party frameworks might look like for developing these mineral supply chains. And, it's also, ironically, in some ways, trying to also, while being critical of the mineral industry, also sort of emphasizing that the mineral industry is also important, because on the environmental front, traditionally, the environmental movement, as I know, has been very opposed to mining, sort of sees mining as sort of the root of evil. In many ways, the environmental movement was opposed to mining sort of before it was opposed to carbon emissions. And so really sort of communicating that this is, there's always environmental impacts and we have to do better with them, but also this is very necessary for navigating the clean energy transition and avoiding sort of climate impacts that we're all worried about. So there's also some work to be done on this front as well, on sort of establishing that, mining is needed for the clean energy transition, and sort of communicating that because we can do it more responsibly, we shouldn't be opposed to it, and by being opposed to it, potentially obstruct our own clean energy transition with a negative trade-off down the road. So I'm interested in that question as well. And more broadly, now that this paper is done, I'm hoping to also sort of ramp up our sort of international climate and energy work as well. There's some important interventions potentially on the policy front in East Asia in the climate sector. I'm very interested in, for example, hydrogen. There might be some greenwashing of the transoceanic trade in hydrogen that some countries like Korea and Japan are very interested in, that I'd like to do some work on as well. So some non-minerals related work too. And then because this paper is focused so much on the electricity sector, we're also turning to electric vehicles, battery storage, and also hydrogen as potential areas where we want to understand better the mineral implications of these other clean tech sectors.
Thank you so much for your time and congratulations again for this really, really important paper. I really loved reading it and I really love your work. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a learning experience for me to listen to you today. I learned so much about the sector. Thanks a lot. And now I will do a Twitter thread on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much again for having me. It is a very interesting topic. So I think in the clean tech space, it's a good area for people to have visibility into and to be thinking about.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.